Okay, so we're diving into election integrity concerns in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania today.
Sounds intriguing.
Yeah, right. It all stems from this Harrisburg 100 article.
Okay.
Have you ever felt like local politics are kind of a black box?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We're going to crack one open today.
All right, let's do it.
So this article, it highlights this clash between John Cobb, who's an election integrity advocate, and the Cumberland County commissioners.
I see.
Cobb is raising some concerns about specific election procedures
Okay.
and claiming they lack transparency.
Interesting.
What's fascinating is that he's advocating for practices that are already in place in a bunch of other Pennsylvania counties.
Huh, so it's not like he's asking for something totally out there.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
He's pushing for things like hand recounts of a small percentage of the ballots,
Okay.
which he argues builds trust in the process because they're more difficult to manipulate.
That makes sense.
And he also wants authorized observers to be present during key parts of the process, like these hand recounts.
Yeah. Gotcha, so that's where the tension comes in.
Yeah, and so the article quotes Commissioner Kelly Niderer,
Okay.
who insists that the county is already following the law and being transparent. But then you have Commissioner Gary Eichelberger, who seems a little more open to dialogue, requesting a list of Cobb's concerns.
So you have like mixed signals coming from the commissioners themselves.
So, totally. And then get this Commissioner Jean Fauci, who oversees elections,
Right.
is totally silent in this whole exchange,
Oh, wow.
which is kind of odd, don't you think?
Yeah, especially because she's been a vocal advocate for trusting the election process in the past.
Exactly.
So her silence is definitely noticeable.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there are disagreements within the Board of Commissioners about how to handle all of this.
Right. Or maybe they're trying to maintain a united front but haven't fully agreed on a strategy
So for sure.
behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's like this little political drama unfolding right here.
Haha, exactly.
But okay, so why should we care about this?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Why should our listeners care about some obscure election procedures in one Pennsylvania county?
Well, I think it gets to the heart of this issue of trust in elections.
Okay.
You know, if people don't have confidence that votes are being counted accurately and fairly, the entire system starts to break down.
It makes sense. You know, we all remember how contentious things got on the national stage in recent elections.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
This situation in Cumberland County, it's like on a smaller scale, but it kind of echoes those same anxieties and distrust.
Exactly. And the debate about observer access in particular, it really highlights this larger tension between security and transparency in elections.
Yeah, because you want the process to be secure and protected from tampering.
Of course.
But you also want it to be open enough so people can feel confident that it's being conducted fairly.
It's a tough balance.
It really is. And Cobb's argument seems to be that these hand recounts and the presence of observers, they add a layer of accountability without compromising security.
Which is an argument worth considering.
Absolutely.
Especially since the article points out that a lot of other counties in Pennsylvania are already doing this without any major issues.
Right. So it's not like it's some unprecedented or impractical thing.
Exactly.
So we've got Cobb pushing for more transparency, the commissioners giving very mixed signals, and this underlying question of how to balance security and public trust in elections.
It is fascinating.
It's already getting pretty interesting.
It certainly is, and the article goes into even more detail about these specific procedures in question and the legal framework surrounding them, which I think we should unpack further.
All right, let's dig a little deeper.
Let's do it.
What exactly is Cobb saying happened?
Right.
Are his claims actually valid based on Pennsylvania law?
Well, let's take a closer look at the specifics of this 2% hand recount process and what the law actually requires. There might be more to it than meets the eye.
Okay.
Picking up where we left off, let's unpack these 2% hand recounts that Cobb is advocating for. The article mentions that Pennsylvania law requires counties to do a recount of a statistical sample of at least 2% of the ballots.
Okay, so the recount itself isn't the issue. It's how they're doing it right.
Exactly. The law doesn't actually specify that this recount has to be done by hand.
Oh, interesting.
Counties can use electronic voting machines, hand counting, or a combination of both.
So Cumberland County is technically following the letter of the law by using machines for the recount.
Right.
But Cobb's arguing that hand recounts are simply more transparent and harder to manipulate, which strengthens public trust.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that the article highlights how 3/4 of Pennsylvania counties have opted for hand recounts.
Wow.
Despite not being legally required to do so. It seems like there's a recognition in many parts of the state that hand recounts, while perhaps more time-consuming,
Yeah.
offer a higher level of assurance to voters.
Makes you wonder why Cumberland County wouldn't follow suit, especially if it's a relatively common practice elsewhere.
Well, Commissioner Niderer claims their current practices are transparent enough.
Right.
But it seems Cobb disagrees.
Okay.
He's also concerned about observer access, or lack thereof, during these recounts.
Didn't he mention something about restrictive rules that prevent meaningful observation?
Yes.
Like observers being kept too far away to actually see what's going on?
Yes. And that's where things get a bit more complex legally.
Okay.
Pennsylvania law does give authorized representatives of candidates and political parties the right to observe the counting and tabulation of votes.
Okay.
But it also gives counties some flexibility in setting rules for those observers, things like where they can stand, what they can touch, etc.
So it's kind of a balancing act, right?
Exactly.
Trying to ensure the process is secure and accurate while also allowing for meaningful observation.
Exactly. And that's often where disputes arise.
Makes sense.
What one side considers a reasonable security measure,
Right.
the other side might see as an attempt to obstruct transparency.
I guess it ultimately comes down to whether those rules genuinely prevent observers from doing their job effectively.
Exactly.
Like if they can't get close enough to see the ballots or hear what's being said, then their presence is practically meaningless.
Precisely. And it's important to remember we're talking about a 2% recount here, a very small sample of the total ballots.
Right.
It seems like the risk of interference from observers in such a limited recount would be pretty minimal.
So you're saying the county's argument for such tight restrictions might not hold much water?
It's certainly worth scrutinizing.
Okay.
And this leads us to another area of concern highlighted in the article, the adjudication of provisional ballots.
Right. These are the ballots that are cast when there's a question about a voter's eligibility,
Yeah.
and they have to be reviewed separately.
Exactly. Now, imagine a really close election, potentially decided by a handful of votes. Those provisional ballots could become incredibly important, right?
Absolutely. They could be the deciding factor.
Right.
But I thought Cobb said the laws around observer access for these provisional ballots are even less clear.
You're right. The law isn't as specific when it comes to this process.
Okay.
There's no explicit requirement for counties to allow observers during provisional ballot adjudication.
So Cumberland County isn't technically breaking any rules by excluding observers.
Not necessarily, but again, the general principle of election transparency would suggest that this process should be open to observation.
Yeah.
Especially given how crucial these ballots can be.
And Cobb alleges that in Cumberland County, a representative from the Dave McCormick campaign was denied access to observe this very process.
Right.
That seems pretty problematic, even if it's not technically illegal.
It certainly raises red flags. It's
Yeah.
one thing to have vague rules that could be interpreted in different ways.
Right.
It's another thing entirely to allegedly deny access outright.
Yeah.
That kind of action feeds directly into the distrust and suspicion that Cobb is trying to address.
It makes it seem like they have something to hide, even if they don't.
Exactly. And remember, Cobb is not alleging specific instances of fraud.
Right.
He's focused on the lack of transparency.
Right.
And how that lack of transparency breeds suspicion.
Regardless of whether anything nefarious is actually happening.
Exactly.
So even if their intentions are good, the impact of their actions is still damaging public trust.
Precisely. And I think that brings us to the crux of this issue. It's not just about following the letter of the law.
Oh.
It's about fostering a culture of openness and accountability that makes voters feel confident in the process.
Regardless of their political leanings.
Exactly.
It seems like a pretty common sense approach.
It does, doesn't it?
What's so hard about that?
Well, the article suggests that there might be some resistance to change from the county commissioners.
Okay.
Commissioner Nider in particular seems to be defending the status quo.
But if other counties are doing it differently, and Cobb is pointing to specific examples of how this lack of transparency is eroding public trust,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be wise for the commissioners to at least consider making some changes?
You would think so, wouldn't you? But politics can be a strange animal.
Right, because sometimes it's not about what's logical or efficient.
Right.
It's about power dynamics and protecting the status quo.
Exactly. And the article hints at that dynamic being at play here.
Okay.
But I think there's another important element we haven't explored yet. The role of the elections director, Bethany Salcerulo.
Oh, yeah. Cobb actually praised her work, right?
He did.
He said his issue isn't with her, but with the Board of Elections, meaning the commissioners.
That's a crucial distinction, and it might offer a path forward.
Okay.
Maybe there's a way to work with the elections director to implement some of these transparency measures without getting bogged down in political battles with the commissioners.
That's an interesting thought. It's like finding a workaround within the system itself.
Exactly. But to understand if that's even feasible, we need to dive a bit deeper into Cobb's specific allegations and the legal arguments he's making.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of that.
Right.
Is Cobb just making noise, or does he have a legitimate case?
All right, so is John Cobb just making noise, or does he have a legitimate case based on Pennsylvania law?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Right. Well, the article lays out some pretty specific allegations.
Okay.
Let's start with the 2% hand recount.
Okay.
Remember, the law requires the recount, but it doesn't mandate that it has to be done by hand.
Right. And Cumberland County is using machines for the recount, which they're allowed to do.
Correct.
But Cobb's saying that hand recounts are more transparent and harder to manipulate, and he points to all these other counties that are doing them.
Exactly. And that's an important point. You know, when a practice becomes so widespread, even without a legal requirement, it starts to look like the standard, the best practice.
Right.
So Cumberland County choosing to deviate from that norm definitely raises questions.
But is it actually illegal?
Right.
Did Cobb take them to court over this?
It's tricky.
Okay.
He could argue that using machines, while technically legal, undermines the spirit of transparency that the law is meant to uphold.
Okay.
But proving that in court would be a challenge.
Yeah, for sure.
What about the observer access issue?
Right.
Cobb claims they were kept too far away to effectively observe the process.
Yeah.
Isn't that a clearer violation?
Yeah. Seems like it would be.
Potentially. Pennsylvania law does grant authorized representatives the right to observe the counting of votes, which would include this recount.
Okay.
However, the law also gives counties some leeway in setting rules for observers, things like where they can stand, what they can touch, etc.
So it's a judgment call.
Right.
And Cobb is saying that Cumberland County's judgment is way too restrictive.
Exactly.
Their rules basically make it impossible for observers to do their jobs.
And that's where things get interesting legally.
Okay.
If Cobb could prove that the county's rules are unreasonable and intentionally obstructive, he might have a case, but it would come down to arguing that those rules go beyond what's necessary for security and actually infringe on the right to observe.
So it's a bit of a gray area.
It is.
Which probably means lots of lawyers and legal arguments back and forth. It sounds messy.
It could be, but what's even messier from a public perception standpoint is the allegation about the provisional ballot adjudication.
Right. Those are the ballots that need extra review.
Yeah.
And they can be super important in close elections.
Absolutely.
But the law isn't clear about observer access for that process, is it?
No, it's much more vague.
Okay.
And that's what makes this allegation that a representative from the Dave McCormick campaign was denied access so troubling.
Right.
Even if it's not a clear-cut legal violation, it looks really bad.
It just feeds into that suspicion that something shady is going on, even if it isn't.
Exactly. And that's what I keep coming back to, Even if Cumberland County can technically justify every decision they made, even if they haven't broken any specific laws, the fact that these questions are even being raised points to a bigger problem.
A problem of perception, a lack of trust.
Right. And that's not something that you can just fix with legal arguments and technicalities. It requires building a culture of transparency and open communication.
Which is what Cobb seems to be advocating for.
Exactly.
So where do we go from here?
That's the question.
What can our listeners sitting there in Cumberland County actually do about this?
Well, the first thing is to stay informed.
Okay.
This Harrisburg 100 article is a great start, but keep digging.
Okay.
Look into how other counties are handling these same processes. See what kind of observer rules they have in place.
Knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. The more you understand how things are supposed to work, the easier it is to spot potential problems.
And don't be afraid to contact your elected officials, especially the county commissioners.
Right.
Ask them directly about these concerns.
Exactly.
What's their rationale for not allowing hand recounts? Why are their observer rules so restricted?
Make them explain themselves.
Hold them accountable.
Exactly. And if their answers aren't satisfactory, consider getting involved with local advocacy groups. There are organizations that focus on election integrity, and they're always looking for people to help raise awareness and push for change.
So what we're really talking about is civic engagement. right? This isn't just about one county or one election.
It's not.
It's about making sure our democracy works the way it's supposed to.
That's it perfectly. You know, we can't just assume the system will take care of itself.
Right.
It takes active, informed citizens to ensure that our elections are truly free, fair, and transparent.
And that is the real takeaway from this deep dive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Sometimes local politics, it can feel like this distant, complicated world.
Oh, for sure.
But this situation in Cumberland County is a reminder that it affects us all.
It does.
And we all have a role to play in shaping it.
Absolutely.
So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.